Grunge. No, I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about the music, the culture, the converse. Grunge music. Probably my favorite genre of music, but why did the genre die? I mean, arguably, one of the most popular bands of all time, Nirvana, happens to be a grunge band. So, how is it even possible that the genre died with that being the case? Is it because nobody is talking about it anymore? Is the sound outdated? Are the messages too unrelatable to modern times? Let's find out.
Please welcome back to the program, Candlebox.
Before I get into the history of grunge music, let me talk about the culture. Much like punk, grunge challenges societal norms, which is why you've probably seen pictures of Cobain in a dress. Because at that time, that was obviously a very taboo thing to see. Grunge kind of represents the dirty, grimy, unkempt, I don't really care attitude. Nihilism being at the forefront, although you don't have to be nihilist to enjoy grunge, obviously. But that's what grunge is all about, being yourself and not really caring how others perceive you. Similarly to that of punk, but instead of mohawks you had long messy hair, instead of leather and docks you have flannels and Converse, a style many still adapt and wear today, including myself. Grunge goes a lot deeper than you think. Where Illinois has Midwest emo, Seattle has grunge. It's a subgenre of metal and punk. Grunge was a response to the overblown and commercialized genre of hair metal. But where did the term grunge come from? The first noted instance of referring to Seattle band as grunge was in a 1981 letter by Mark Arm, according to Clark Humphrey in his account of the Seattle music scene, Loser. In his letter, in which he nominated his own band, Mr. Ep and the Calculations, as the most overrated band in Seattle, Arm writes, "I hate Mr. Ep and the Calculations. Pure grunge, pure noise, pure shit." Of course, Epps as a band didn't even exist. The first grunge record ever released was Come On Down by Green River in 1985. Shortly after, a year later in 1986, a compilation album titled The Deep Six was released by CZ Records. This record featured 6 bands that are heavily considered to be the fathers of the Seattle sound: Green River, Melvins, Malfunction, Skinyard, Soundgarden, and U-Man. Bruce, and I may pronounce his last name wrong, Bruce Pavitt, later claimed to have popularized the term grunge as a musical label in 1987, when he wrote some promotional copy for Green River describing the band as ultra loose grunge that destroyed the morals of a generation. 1987 would be the same year that Soundgarden released their first official project, the Screaming Life EP. Humphrey also notes that a Sub Pop press release described Mudhoney as ultra sludge, glacial, heavy, special, dirty punk. It was among the many references Sub Pop would make toward grunge in its marketing, an exploitation they cheerfully fed to reporters and fans. Green River were the first grunge band to ever release a grunge record, which kickstarted the whole Seattle music scene, and they also helped establish the Sub Pop record label with Bruce Pavitt, which still exists to this day and even posts on YouTube. Although Green River no longer exists as a band, their breakup led to some of the best grunge bands of all time, with their ex-members forming bands like Mudhoney and Mother Love Bone, MLB of which later then separated to form Pearl Jam. And although grunge started as a response and protest against commercialization, it slowly became what it swore to destroy, Soundgarden being the first grunge band to sign to a major record label, A&M, shortly followed by that of Alice in Chains and Screaming Trees. Sub Pop 200 was a compilation album released in 1988 by the Sub Pop record label, and although Sub Pop 100 featured no grunge, Sub Pop 200 did. In fact, it was an all grunge record. 20 bands on the album: Tad, Blood Circus, Cat Butt, yes, you heard that right, and many more. Here's the list. 1989 was a huge year for grunge, with the release of Bleach, Nirvana's debut album, as well as Soundgarden's Louder Than Love, and Mudhoney's self-titled album. And despite being formed in 1987, Alice in Chains in 1990 released their debut album, Facelift. If you were born between 1980 and 2000, you have undoubtedly heard at least one grunge song in your life and probably liked or even loved it. Courtney Love, most notably of Hole and also as being Kurt Cobain's wife, was in a band before Hole called Babes in Toyland, releasing their first record in 1990 called Spanking Machine, making her the first female grunge singer. In 1990, Nirvana signed with Geffen Records and started working on their label debut shortly after. Chad Channing, not to be confused with Channing Tatum, the former drummer of Nirvana, left after they signed with Geffen, causing Kurt and the rest of the band to bring in Dave Grohl as their new drummer. Nevermind was then released in 1991 under Geffen Records and was a smash hit. So big in fact that in 1992, Nevermind took over Michael Jackson as the #1 album on the Billboard. Smells Like Teen Spirit was such a huge hit that it still charts to this day. Oh, speaking of women in music, L7 was the first all-female grunge band, releasing their debut album with Sub Pop in 1991 entitled Smell the Magic, and although broken up after 2001, they reformed in 2014. Also in 1990, Temple of the Dog was formed with Chris Cornell of Soundgarden and Eddie Vedder of the soon-to-be Pearl Jam. In 1991, Temple of the Dog released their debut self-titled album, shortly after, Pearl Jam doing the same in the same year with their album 10. Smashing Pumpkins, although not from Seattle, were accepted in the grunge scene for their unique take on the genre, as well as the aforementioned Courtney Love forming Hole. Eddie Vedder split from Temple of the Dog in 1992, and Nirvana released In Utero in the same year. This album was a revolt against all of the fame they gained during Nevermind. In that same year, Stone Temple Pilots released one of my favorite albums of all time, Core, although grunge bands such as Bush and Stone Temple Pilots were faced with criticism as neither were from Seattle, and although some still don't consider them grunge, I digress. In 1993, not a whole lot of notable things happened, but Candlebox did release their debut self-titled album, and Smashing Pumpkins released Siamese Dream, another great album. Oh, and the Melvins released their best album to date, Houdini. Then, the turn of grunge happened. 1994.
Tonight, word of an untimely death. Kurt Cobain was the lead singer of the group Nirvana. Their albums were bestsellers, their songs filled with images of despair and violence. One lyric, "The sun is gone, but I have a light, the day is done, but I'm having fun." And then this morning, his body found at home, another casualty of success. Here's ABC's Tom Foreman.
After the tragic suicide of Kurt Cobain in 1994, the grunge scene took a huge hit, as Kurt was considered the figurehead of grunge music. Grunge would never be the same. Former Nirvana drummer Dave Grohl then went to form Foo Fighters. Courtney Love, Kurt's widow, released with her band Hole the album Live Through This, a week after his alleged suicide. Later of which, and by later I mean in 2021, Love got mad at Olivia Rodrigo for having a kinda similar but not really album cover. Later in the same year, the posthumous MTV Unplugged in New York Nirvana album was released. After the death of Kurt, some could say grunge had some of its strongest albums, Super Unknown by Soundgarden and Alice in Chains self-titled, both in 1995, and canonically, it is thought that Soundgarden's last album, Down on the Upside, is considered the death of the genre as a whole. But is it actually dead? Long story short, yes, it's dead. As previously stated, Nirvana is one of the most popular bands of all time. Grunge culture will never really die, but as for the music, it's kinda hard to say. Grunge music is still happening, Foo Fighters is still around, there are even some good modern grunge bands, such as Dilly Dally, and even Violent Soho. Despite being from Australia, who I genuinely believe could be the head of the new grunge wave if it were to happen. Some could say Kurt took the life of grunge with him, but I think it's so much more than that. With many big grunge bands splitting up by the early 2000s and most of the big five singers passing away, the big five being Kurt Cobain, Layne Staley, Scott Weiland, and Chris Cornell, Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam being the only one that's still alive, I think grunge as a genre and as a message lived the perfect lifespan. Grunge will always have a place in my heart and the hearts of many others, and I think the soul of grunge will live on forever, although as a genre, it won't. And I don't think it has to. It got the messages it needed to across at the time when it was needed the most. Grunge was one of the most important and iconic musical movements ever, and you can undoubtedly see that anywhere you look in the music industry and in the real world. And with that being said, stay lovely, stay awesome, stay fresh, peace.
Mission impossible, mission accomplished. Did it by myself, no accomplice. Except for all the voices in my conscience. Pay me no mind with all that nonsense. Feeding me lies, making me nauseous. This is not a conference, it's an intervention. See all my friends are here, but I forgot to mention it's the wrong dimension.